Before we look at what happens to the value of aces in a multi-way pot, let's look at how it does against just one player, and we're going to give this other player a tight range of about 10.7% here. Okay, so we got that set up, and against that range, aces has 83.56% equity if we include ties. And let's say we take a flop against this range. Well, okay, aces has about 83.19% equity, including ties. It actually does much better than that. Again, they're pretty good against this range. If we break it down, there's only one hand we're worried about, and that's pocket kings. These other hands, top pair hands, and even in this tight range, we have a lot of equity against, especially the ace-king hands. And the only hands we were really concerned about are the flush draws, and we're actually beating those hands, and there's only 4 combos of that. And then some other hands we might get action for are the under pairs. So if we break it down, it looks something like this. Again, the hands we're most likely to get action from are the top pair and the flush draw hands. Flush draws, and even not so much, but top pair hands we definitely want to get action from. And of course, possibly some action from under pairs as well. Now let's look at what we do multi-way. We'll start out with 3 players here, and these are random hands here. We've got random hands for player 2 and 3, and we're using the Poker Online calculator for this data here. Now, in this situation, we have a 73.26%. And, okay, going forward, what we want to find out is how aces does against a specific range, because most players don't play random hands. So players 2 and 3 are going to play, we're going to use this assumption. Now, some players play more, some players do less, but we'll use this assumption in our ones going forward. That's about almost a 20% range, 19.8% range. We'll use this for the 4 and 5 player simulations as well. Now, if we look at 3-player here against this specific range, our equity is approximately 71.36%. Some factors to keep in mind when you get a multi-way pot, not just pre-flop, flop, turn, whatever, is a lot of factors, or some of the factors depends on opponent's range, what ranges they play, which can change their equity. And another factor is how our range is perceived, based on what lines that we take and what lines our opponent takes with certain hands, where you can try to narrow that down, and possibly any other factors or table dynamics I haven't mentioned above. Now let's expand this to 4 players here. And we see our equity drops to 61.62%, including the ties again. And what we're really worried about is if we get, let's say we raise with aces or we limp with aces, we're really worried about is the potential landmines post-flop that one of these players will have. Most of the hands we have we're going to beat, but when tighter players put their entire stack in, you're getting the worst of it in most cases. Now, if an aggressive player does it, maybe not so much. They have like a big draw or something, so they have equity they're pushing. Now let's expand to 5 players here, and our equity drops to 54.32% multi-way. And if we take this a step further and go 6 players and against all random hands here instead of the range we were doing earlier, our equity drops to approximately 48.75 or 48.99% if you count the ties. Now let's take a look at a few different types of situations on boards with multiple callers here. For these examples, I'm going to give player 2 king queen suited and player 3 8 7 of spades. And against these 2 hands pre-flop, aces is approximately 62.54% equity. Actually, 8 7 of spades is a higher equity. Because they can make more straights and stuff like that, and flushes, whereas king queen has a problem with a heart flush because ace has a redraw. So let's go ahead and take a look at a random board here where both players have, actually everybody here is a pair, and in this case aces has a pretty good equity, about almost 63%. Now let's say aces runs into a problem here where 8-7 or player number 3 has 2 pair and player 2 has top pair. In this case, Ace's equity has dropped significantly to below around 16% or so. Another situation where player 3 has bottom 2 pair and player 2 has a flush draw. Ace's equity is dropped considerably in that situation. Another potential action board where Aces actually has, the best pair, but there's a couple big draws out there. And equity-wise, we do this multi-way. Aces is not the best hand. They're player number 1 there. Now, some things to consider, or some things in conclusion here, are it can be a little bit tricky because it's all based on what ranges opponents play. But typically speaking, the more players in the hand, the more the multi-way equity declines in Aces. Now, obviously, we don't play it all. We play more than one street. We play, flop, turn, river. Now, another big consideration when you're playing Aces multi-way is what level of thinking players are on, and that can have big implications as far as if the hand's good or not. And then going again, what players' pre and post flop style is, and this goes back to let's say multi-way or versus heads up. Some players play very, very tight multi-way to where you pretty much know when you're beat if you got stuck in a multi-way pot with a hand, whereas heads up they might play much more aggressive, where your aces have a lot more equity against them heads up because they don't necessarily put you on the hand, depending back to the level of thinking and post flop style and stuff like that. And then the question is, how do players value their hands in certain situations, and any other factors we might not have mentioned. In summary, Aces can be very tricky to play multi-way because it's a pretty strong hand that you don't necessarily want to fold. But when you're beat, you don't want to, or when they're cracked, you don't want to lose a lot of money with them or a lot of chips with them. So basically, in short, they're tricky to play, but it's like walking through a minefield. Potentially, the more players you get in the pot, but if you're really good at reading specific styles and what people do in certain situations, it can be a potential gold mine as well if you get stuck in the situation. But again, it depends on a lot of different factors and dynamics and stuff like that. But yeah, obviously, the more players you let in, the more your equity decreases. What you're really concerned about isn't so much, okay, I know my equity is going to be less in a nutshell, but okay, post-flop, how does my specific equity against, player X or player Y, player 4, player 5, player 6, how's my specific equity against what type of actions they would take post-flop? And that's one of the trickier parts of this. And that pretty much wraps up our tutorial for what happens to Aces in a multi-way pot. Thank you for watching.